everybody, welcome back to the Trial and Error Podcast. I'm Emma Grace.
And I'm Austin.
And today we are going to be talking about 1L classes. So me and Austin are officially done.
Woo!
Or I guess it's Austin and I. I know a lot of you are probably still in finals, so best of luck. But if you're out, congratulations. So before we get into ranking the 1L classes, it would be helpful to know what they actually are. So we're going to go through them. First, I feel like if you've listened to our podcast, you should know what civil procedure is by now, because apparently I talk about it a lot. And we had the wonderful Judy Cornett on, who is a civil procedure teacher. But basically, all the other classes are learning the law, but this is how to apply it. So this is how you go to court and actually file. And it seems simple, but if you think about it, it's like, okay, you want to sue someone that worked on your car. Well, where did they work on your car? Was it here? Is that a state claim? Is that a tort claim? Is there a federal law involved? Do you need to go to federal court? And if it's in a different state, how do you sue them there? And can you sue them there? And there's a lot of different aspects that go into it, but it is really interesting. But a lot of people do not like specifically the federal rules of civil procedure. So every state has its own rules of civil procedure. They govern everything from how you write a brief to the court to how many days you have to do certain things to how to file a motion. But obviously the federal law system has its own, and they're quite convoluted. And for us, unfortunately, we learn them before we learn basically anything else, and it's a mess. So that's basically civil procedure. You've got the side of what I was explaining before is called jurisdiction, and then you have how to actually do, would you call it decorum, I guess?
Procedure.
Yeah. I think also it goes without saying for every episode, but for this one especially, we are 1Ls. So we're explaining this from our perspective. I am sure there are scholars out there that could explain it much better, but that's your extremely dumbed down version, and hopefully it's relatively accurate.
Yeah, so our first semester was spent doing the federal rules of civil procedure. And I know some universities do it the other way, and I actually wish ours did it too, where the second semester was like the big picture idea of what and why you do civil procedure. The second semester was what courts you can sue in and where and all that stuff that Emma Grace just talked about. But the first semester was how many days do you have to file? And it's 60 plus rules that you just need to learn and memorize. And our professor didn't do it in order, so that made it difficult. Like, the thing that helped me the most when I was studying for the final was just sitting down and reading them in order. And I was like, oh my gosh, these make so much more sense when you just read them in order instead of talk about them theoretically as you're going through the course.
Yeah, and professors have strong opinions too on the federal rules, and so they'll like stop and talk about it and ask us our opinion. I'm like, dude, I don't even know how to go to the courthouse and sue right now. Like, I do not know if this is a well-pleaded claim under Iqbal or whatever. So, yeah, you'll know what I mean. The girls that know. That's all I gotta say.
All right, the next class that we're going to talk about is torts. Torts is basically how you can sue someone else. Like, we'll talk about contracts in a minute, and that's different. But torts is someone hurts you, and we don't want to send them to jail, but we don't want to encourage them to continue to hurt you. So, like, our class went over assault and battery, and then defamation, and then all the different ways that you can sue people, whether or not employers are liable for their employees.
Yeah, it's all basically how to sue people. It's the most stereotypical, I think, besides crim law, like what you're thinking, medical malpractice and things like that. It's like, you hurt me and I would like money, please.
Yeah, these are all the billboard attorneys. Morgan & Morgan's like a big one. I don't know any other major ones, but if you've heard of them and they have something on TV, like, these are the attorneys that 1-800-ASK-GARY will send you to, because you've been harmed and these people are trying to take a percentage of what you'll get back.
Yeah, so civil procedure is basically how to sue, and torts is what you're suing for, and there's all different kinds of torts.
Next, we have contracts. Contracts is basically what it sounds like, whether or not there is a contract first off, and then whether or not someone breached and how you can recover and how many damages you can recover. So our first semester was all about whether or not a contract existed. We spent probably 3 weeks on whether or not there was an offer, and then you go through acceptance, consideration. What are the other elements? I feel like there's one more.
That was a long time ago.
Clearly you don't remember as much as you think.
I feel like it's offer, acceptance, and consideration, but there's a billion things under each of them.
Yeah, I think that was it. So you've got offer, acceptance, and consideration the first semester. We also went into a couple of like what are called formation defenses, which basically means that something else was involved that made it so the contract, even though all three of those elements were there, still didn't actually happen. One of them, for example, is mistake. Like if someone is talking about something and they're wrong about it, then you don't actually have a contract.
Yeah. And we did a lot of like when you can revoke acceptance, when it's actually acceptance, what offers can look like, all that jazz. And I actually found that to be easier than our semester now because it was a lot more succinct, kind of like what we were saying about civil procedure. It's nice when you start out with big picture and then get into the nitty gritty.
Yeah, and then our second semester was mostly about whether or not people breached and then how much you can sue people for. So we went over the different kind of damages there are and then different ways that people breach. At what point does someone breaking the contract mean you don't have to do anything versus only being able to recover some of the damages that they caused by breaking the contract, stuff like that.
Yeah, so this is a great class for people really interested in working for a business, maybe starting their own business, and it's basically the other kind of civil procedure type suits, but they're not torts. So next is property. Property is, I think, exactly what it sounds like. It's property, but honestly, you don't learn a ton about like how to buy a house and all that kind of stuff. It's more learning about the history of property and why maybe property law doesn't make as much sense as you think it would. Because if you think about it, property law is something that's been around forever. I'm talking like Magna Carta, even before, and we have parts of that in our law today. So it's really important as a lawyer for other people to understand those aspects of the law and all these like kind of funky rules that we still keep today. And then we also, of course, did talk about how to get title, how to know that your title's good, covenants that come with the land, and that sort of thing. But a lot of it was about your interest in property and how maybe you don't actually possess a property yet, but you have an interest in it, and then what happens when you possess it. So it's kind of nitty-gritty law right there. I think a lot of people are scared of it because it uses a lot of words we don't know and isn't necessarily common sense all the time. But it's a very useful class, and of course, if you're interested in any kind of real estate law, like, you gotta know your property. So
yeah, I would add too that to me, property was most like that first semester of civil procedure we were talking about, where it's just like a bunch of rules that you need to remember. My class didn't go that much into like the theory behind why we do certain things or anything like that. It was all about how to transfer land and all the rules. Like if you have a comma in the wrong place, then your grandpa screwed you, basically.
Dang, Grandpa. Rude. Okay, so the last for us as far as content that we actually took this year is criminal law. Now we're starting to get into the ones that different law schools do differently. I think everybody, no matter where you go, does civil procedure, torts, and contracts and property, but sometimes criminal law is switched out with constitutional law, and I think rarely property is switched out with constitutional law. We did not take constitutional law. It's required for us, but we take it our second year. So for us, we actually did criminal law first. Criminal law is exactly what it sounds like. This is getting into your TV show, Criminal Minds, Law and Order, all that, but the realistic version and understanding what's going on behind all those laws. A lot of laws are written with words that have a lot of meaning behind them that you might not quite understand. For example, different crimes have a different state of culpability that you need. Like if you had knowledge you were doing something, or you just kind of knew you were doing something, but just were like, whatever, I'm going to do it anyways. Or maybe you were more negligent, and those really matter in how lawmakers write the law. I honestly feel like this one is very fruitful for policy, and you can see why, because lawmakers are the ones writing the laws, and then us as people that are more in the judicial system are enforcing them. So it is a very political thing. It's a very interesting thing, how to write a law, how to enact a law, how to enforce it as a prosecutor. And that is basically what we learn about in criminal law. And then, of course, we use examples of certain kinds of crimes. I think we spent, for us, the most amount of time on homicide, but there are lots of different crimes that you will study.
I would add that this is where your professor has the opportunity to be like the most provocative with how they talk about things. My professor, we went really hard into discretion at the different levels of the legal system before someone goes to jail. And people will have different opinions about how much discretion the prosecutor should have. Like, should they be required to go after people who are committing crimes, or should they be able to decide which crimes they want to enforce? And then you have the legislature, who has discretion to write laws, and then the judicial system, who has the discretion on how to interpret the law. So you have so many different areas where someone can avoid going to jail. And in the meantime, we also have the highest incarceration rate out of all of the developed countries.
It's really interesting because this is also, like, I would say, the law with the most morals compared to all the others. And so it is interesting that our law is changing a lot in this area based on how our morals change. Speaking of, all the ones that we've done so far are rooted in what we call common law. So it's basically English law that we brought over, maybe changed a little bit, maybe codified it, maybe wrote it down. But overall, it hasn't changed in a long time, or little changes are happening slowly, and we've taken it from English law. Up until now, we've been talking about common law. The big difference is obviously constitutional law. So constitutional law is about the American Constitution. So obviously, everything that you're doing in that class comes from the Supreme Court and what they have been up to in the precedents that they're setting. We obviously haven't taken it yet, so I'm not going to speak too much on it like I know anything, because I don't. But I would assume, a lot of our Constitution is based on ideas that came from England, but overall, we're our own country now. We're America, and we wrote the Constitution. So the Constitution is what you will be studying. So it's basically the Supreme Court, what you're studying. And it's also a very complex thing, because first you have your articles, which is like the actual Constitution that's explaining how the government works. But then, of course, I'm sure we'll devote a lot of time to the amendments, which has a lot of precedent and background. At this point, I feel like you can't just read an amendment and actually know what it means. Like, you have to go figure out what the court has said that it means and what that means for you today. So I'm sure we'll be doing a lot of that in constitutional law.
At this point, our only exposure to constitutional law has been a little bit of due process with criminal law. And then besides that, all the civil procedure stuff, because the Supreme Court is the one that ultimately determines how the federal rules of civil procedure apply. So you focus a lot on the Supreme Court's interpretation of certain rules.
Yeah, so that's like the 7th Amendment, the 14th Amendment. We also do a bit of the First Amendment with defamation, but it's kind of more like a background to what we're doing rather than exploring that. And then for me, actually, and we'll get into this, all of our legal writing sections have different cases that we work on that are fake, and for ours it was a 4th Amendment case, so we did a lot of 4th Amendment law. And you did some international law, so I don't know if that would be considered constitutional law, but...
The other class that we took was legal writing. It's called legal process at University of Tennessee. And then we also had like an add-on class called legal research. Legal research was basically how to use the different softwares that different firms are going to be using. Westlaw and Lexis were the primary two. My class did a little bit with Bloomberg Law. But basically, that one is learning how to use the tools. And then your writing class is actually developing your writing skills. So in Legal Process 1, we wrote a memo to a senior attorney basically explaining what the law was, where someone did something and they want to be a client of ours. So whether or not like we think they have a good case, but you can't be too persuasive with that because it's like an internal memo. You're not trying to convince anyone of anything, just whether or not it's going to be a successful case or not. And that was a closed universe where the professor provided all of the materials that we were allowed to reference. And then the second semester, my class did a motion for summary judgment and then an appellate brief where the professor provided some guidance on cases to use, but we weren't limited to those cases. So I think I ended up using like 25 cases or so in my final draft.
Yeah, me too. And so that one you're writing to the court, so it's a lot more persuasive, and you're appealing something the court's already decided. So for ours, it was a motion to suppress evidence. But yeah, it's different for everybody, and I think this is the one that like so many schools do it so differently. Some people, it's all one class. For us, it's legal processes one class, and legal research, it's a whole other thing. Some people do it one semester, some people do it all year. So it really just depends on your school. I actually really liked how we did it. I would say I would love a little bit more of a connection between legal research and legal process, like having our professor that first semester, like Austin said, during the closed universe, show us how she got to those sources in the first place and have us kind of follow along to figure it out. Because the things that you do in legal research to learn the software are kind of abstract. But yeah, I mean, overall, it's just the writing class, and honestly probably the most important one as far as real world stuff.
Yeah, that's the one I'm most proud of, like getting a higher grade than other people in, because that's the one that when you're interviewing with people, you're going to be able to say, hey, I'm one of the best writers, and I may not know the law perfectly yet, but I'll be able to get you to what you need to do in front of a judge.
Right, because your first few jobs, they're going to be trusting you as far as editing skills, researching skills, and writing skills. So it's like, I might not be the best at Civ Pro, but look at me. I can form a sentence that's coherent in the law. And you believe me when I say not a ton of people can do that. So now that we've talked about the classes and what they are, we're going to talk a little bit about UT specifically so you understand more our background before we rank our classes.
Yeah, we've kind of already talked about this, but different schools take different approaches on how to divide the classes up. And University of Tennessee appears to be going through a discussion about whether or not what they're doing is what's best for the students. But at our school, we do civil procedure over 2 semesters, and both are 3 credit hours. We do torts over 2 semesters, and the first semester is 3 credit hours, and the second semester is 2 credit hours. We do contracts over 2 semesters, and both are 3 credit hours. Property is a 1-semester course, but it's 4 credit hours. Criminal law is a 1-semester course, but it's only 3 credit hours. And then constitutional law is a 4 credit hour course. You don't take that your first year. At University of Tennessee, you're not allowed to pick any of your first year courses, but you can take constitutional law at any point before you graduate. And then you have legal writing and research, and both of those are full year first year courses. Legal research is 1 credit hour total over 2 semesters, and then legal writing is 3 credit hours each semester.
So every school's a little bit different, but I would say the majority, if not all, don't let you pick your 1L classes, because these are classes that are on the bar and they're very fundamental to the next classes. Because UT has a really good bar passing rate, we have a little bit more leeway with the classes we get to pick. We can concentrate in certain things. We can do certain kinds of classes that we just find interesting. They don't have to be on the bar. But next year we have to take professional responsibility and constitutional law, and then the rest of the year is up to us, whatever we want to take. And then we have some like generic requirements, kind of how undergrad does. Like you need one where you've like done some drafting of like a contract or something like that. You need to do one where you've done more public speaking, that kind of thing, more generic requirements so that you're a well-rounded person when you leave law school. But some schools do kind of make your schedule more or have more required classes throughout all 3 years just to make sure you are taking those bar classes. And some schools have none after 1L, and you can do whatever you want because they're confident you're going to pass the bar. Ours is a little bit of a mix, which I enjoy because I feel like they're helping us with what's important to have a basis of the law, but they trust us to have freedom because once you get to studying for the bar, you're not going to remember your 1L classes much anyway, so it's more just to understand the law in general so that you can take the classes you want and build a knowledge and understanding of the areas that you enjoy.
Yeah, one thing, too, that University of Tennessee does that seems to be different than most other universities is we have a very high first-year course load requirement. You take 33 credit hours during your first year, which is a lot. We only need 89 to graduate, so you're way over your 1/3 when it comes to what your graduation requirements are. I know a couple other universities do like between 24 and 27, and that helps like ease people into law school. So I know a couple people that were not happy with how many classes we had to take.
Honestly, I feel like that feeling when you graduate undergrad now. I'm like, yeah, I did that when I was crazy and I did that. So I think it was really rewarding for us, honestly, because now I feel like, especially because a lot of our 2L classes, most of them, the ones that aren't required, aren't on a curve anymore, like a mandatory curve. So I feel like I'm back to being a student again. Like I'm not as worried about my grades. It's not a pressure cooker as much. It's like I did it. Now I just got to graduate and get a job. So I don't know. I personally liked it this way just to get it done, but I understand why people would maybe want to be eased in more. Okay, so now we're actually going to rank as our grand finale to this episode. First, we're going to talk about what we believe to be the easiest to hardest. We've actually ranked separately and not told each other. So Austin's going to go first and I'll be reacting to his ranking and whether I believe it to be a quality ranking or not.
Yeah, and this isn't necessarily the classes that we got the highest and lowest grades in order. It's more so the classes that we felt the content was easiest to learn. For me, first, I would say contracts was the easiest.
That is a hot take. Continue.
I don't know. My dad taught me how like money works, so I've got a pretty good grasp of numbers. I was originally a finance major for about a year in undergrad, so doing all the like numbers and responsibility and stuff was pretty easy. Our first semester professor was very formulaic with what he wanted, so that helped me like, oh, this is what this is as long as you follow these steps. So just follow all the steps and then you're set. And then the second semester was more of a vibey professor. He focused a lot on like, do you get the gist of what's going on? Not necessarily the specific words that are down. I don't know. For me, it's just fun to see how like you're supposed to manage the efficiency of the market with people not doing what they're supposed to do. So it's kind of like a tension between when is it good for a business to actually break their contract and when are we going to force businesses to follow through on their contract. So I thought that was fun. The second easiest course for me was probably torts, in part because it's like a shorter course load, but torts and criminal law focus a lot on like how principled you are as an individual and like being able to be principled in something and then see where the law differs from those principles. I think makes it easy where you're like, okay, this is how I think it should be, but also this is how it is. And for me, I'm able to pretty clearly draw the line between those two. Third, I had criminal law for pretty similar reasons. It wasn't quite as easy. I don't know why. It just didn't feel as easy.
I think it might be the professor you had. I don't know.
But I had quite a bit of fun in that class. Like that one, we talked more about policy than in any other class. Fourth is probably legal writing. I come from like liberal arts background, so I did a lot of writing essays in undergrad. So that was an easier transition for me than I think it is for a lot of people, where like you're responsible for searching for the sources and then writing a persuasive document out of that. Fifth was civil procedure. That first semester was pretty hard, but I ended up getting like my second highest grade in it. And then second semester I felt like was pretty basic, just when you can sue and where you can sue. So as long as you got the big idea, there were only like 5 or 6 specific rules that you needed to know. And then the hardest was property. I had a professor who, it was her first semester teaching property after being a teacher at UT for, I don't know how long, at least half a decade. It felt like we were learning alongside her and she was deciding what was important for the exam as we were learning. So that was just difficult.
Yeah, and you'll see that a lot of his answers had to do with the professor you have, like whether he was saying it or not. Austin and I have had some professors for the same classes, but we've also had the same professors but for different classes. Like I had the professor for civil procedure first semester, he had for criminal law. And he's never had my criminal law professor. So I think that really does change it. And it has nothing to do with if they're a good or bad professor. It literally just has to do with how your brain works and how they teach the course. For me, I'm a big picture person first, and then I get into the nitty-gritty detail. I think Austin's actually really good at both. So that doesn't necessarily influence what he says as much, but for me it will, as you will see from my ranking. I said the easiest was torts because to me, it feels like common sense. Like almost always torts comes out how my brain's like, yep, that makes sense. I'm not saying it's necessarily right. Like maybe you shouldn't be able to collect that much, or maybe this shouldn't be a tort. But if someone says, hey, you get punched in the face and your eye's bruised, like how do you sue? And I'd be like, okay, well, I would sue for whatever medical expenses and then maybe like some kind of emotional distress. I think anyone in America could say that. Like we kind of understand the torts vibe. So to me, it's familiar, it's common sense, like the material just kind of comes naturally to me, I suppose. That doesn't mean it's easy to test on. I saw this TikTok where someone was like, anyone else just black out during a torts final? And that is totally me because there are so many issues you might not see in the fact pattern. So I'm not saying it's the easiest to test. I'm just saying to me it's the most like I can comprehend it very easily. I actually said crim next, which is funny because I think this is the one we had the most different. Because to me, same as torts, it's common sense and it's familiar. But I will say it's slightly harder in that you have to get rid of some preconceived notions about criminal law, especially if you watched a lot of TV pertaining to criminal law, because you're learning now how it actually works rather than how people talk about it. And those are two very different things sometimes. So just being aware of, oh, this isn't what this kind of murder is, or this is how you prove insanity, and all these kinds of things are actually a lot different than you think they would be. So, but still, I think it's very like fundamental to who we are as humans of like, if I steal your money, you should go to jail and have to give me that money back. I don't know. There are hot take things like the death penalty for sure and everything going on with abortion and all that. But at the end of the day, like the basic crimes that like people are committing day in and day out that are like maybe a little bit less violent, or something like, I break into your house and steal your computer. Well, you just like broke into my house, dude. So yeah, I can tell you to get out of my house. And if I feel like you might hurt me, I can hurt you. I don't know. It just seems, maybe that's a hot take that it's common sense, but it seems like it to me. Next, I have legal process. This is kind of a middle one. I'm like Austin. I've done a lot of writing in undergrad and I was a writing tutor. So I enjoy writing and I enjoy figuring out how legal process works. But it was very humbling at first for 2 reasons. The first reason is that I tend to write in passive voice. I don't know if that's the norm in philosophy, but as someone that wrote a lot in philosophy, I did a lot of passive voice and I got great grades. So I'm not going to say that's the norm for philosophy because honestly, I think it's clearer in active voice. But regardless, I naturally wrote in passive voice and that was really hard because that's the main difference in legal writing is you can't write in passive voice. And the second thing is in philosophy, you're allowed to have chunky sentences. Like, I don't know if you've ever read like Kant or something like that, but dude's got a sentence that's half a page because you don't want to break the logical flow of your sentence, especially if you're like laying out a logical argument. But in law school, you got to chop that girly up. She cannot be that long. And so I had to learn how to be less wordy. In undergrad, I never really used like footnotes or anything like that, but that's kind of where you do that like extra analysis that you think you might need. You can do that in your footnotes in law school. And so just learning when it's worth having the long sentence, when the sentence needs to be cut, and just clarity. And sometimes clarity comes before keeping the whole legal argument in one sentence, if that makes sense. Next for me is contracts. It's relatively common sense, but the thing about contract law is it's not actually real law. Like it comes from the common law and it comes from these restatements that states may or may not have adopted or adopted something similar. And it's basically just custom that has been written down. And so it's kind of plugging and chugging all of that. And it gets very formulaic very quickly. And I guess I'm just not as intuitive about business because it's not as interesting to me. But I'm like, yeah, I guess it makes sense that you need a reasonable time to like see if your package is defective before you turn it back to the manufacturer or whatever. But like, I think it's kind of stupid that you can have a package for 2 months and then argue that, well, I didn't know that it was the product was defective because it wasn't a seasonable time. I don't know. I don't know if I vibe with that.
I don't know. I think about like my relationship with Amazon a lot when I was thinking about contracts. And like the reason Amazon has a 30-day return policy is basically because they have to, and then they sell it to you as a feature because you do have a time to say, oh, this isn't what I thought it was going to be. So I'm going to send it back to you and you're going to give me my money back.
Yeah. I just think it's funny that that's law. I feel like, I don't know. Our professor, both of them were really passionate about contracts, and that made me want to be passionate about contracts, but the passion never came. I'm sorry, Cooney and Kwan. You guys are queens and kings over there, but I don't know. There were just things that were a little bit nonsensical to me, like unconscionability and good faith and fair dealing. I'm like, bruh, it's a contract. What are we doing? Like, if it's not in the contract, why do I gotta write about it? I don't know. Anyways. That was a rant for you girlies that have actually learned this. If you do not know what I'm talking about, please disregard. Next for me is property. Property, I actually don't find that hard. I find it quite interesting. It is a lot like a logical reasoning course. The hardest part about it is you literally sound like you're speaking a foreign language. Like my professor never really defined things at the beginning because he got so excited. And so he would just talk and I'm like, I do not know what you're saying. But once you know all the definitions and put in the time to learn what things are, it becomes easier and it becomes a language to you. And then you're just kind of doing a logical reasoning analysis. So that's why I didn't find it to be the hardest. I actually found Civ Pro to be the hardest because it's not common sense at all. Like at all. Like it is, I mean, maybe, yeah, okay, makes sense that you get 30 days to respond to something or whatever. But like, it's like not intuitive how much fact you need to put in a claim when you're trying to sue someone. It's not intuitive to me what an affirmative defense is as compared to a normal defense. It's not intuitive to me if you're joining a party, how close their claim has to be to yours to be like permissive versus like they need to be there. I don't know. Just none of it to me is quite common sense. I think it can go either way. And there's just so much material. Thankfully in law school, they really limit it to federal rules of civil procedure, but every state has its own civil procedure. And that's crazy to me that I'm going to have to learn, depending on where I go, all these different states and how they're different. And if I'm suing someone in Kentucky, well, now we got all new rules. That's insane to me. Like, that's just not comprehensible. I understand why it's not uniform. States have their rights, blah, blah, blah. But It's gonna make my job real hard, but I guess that's why people pay us. So it's not chewable. It's not digestible. It's too much. I don't know.
That makes sense. I think that, so civil procedure is basically, we need to have rules. So we just make some and then go from there. Like all the Supreme Court cases are how to interpret a rule that they wrote with its origins over 100 years ago, just because we're trying to keep a cohesive system over the course of the country's history. So that way people know in general what's going on. And even though those initial premises may not have been perfect, it's better to keep following them than it is to just like start over. So we're just trying to fit systems kind of into common sense, but also with the rules. So it's like you need to have some sort of an intuition about it to be like, oh, you should have to say why you're suing someone for something. But what that line is kind of arbitrary because we're just trying to have a rule.
Yeah, I totally agree, and it is really important. I think perhaps why I find it so difficult is it maybe becomes more intuitive once you've actually filed. You're like, oh, I understand this rule now. This makes it more fair for my client. This makes it fair for the other side. But as someone that's literally a 1L and has never filed a lawsuit in my life, I'm like, okay, sure, Rule 5, sure, Rule 4, okay, whatever, you can deliver to someone, but unless they're a corporation, then maybe you can't, ? Maybe if they're a manager, ? I don't know. It'd be crazy out there. But anyways, now we'll move on to worst to best. We will rapid fire do these, so Austin's going to tell me worst to best, and I'm going to react and see if I agree.
How would you distinguish worst to best from easiest to hardest?
I distinguish worst from best and easiest to hardest. Easiest to hardest is what was most comprehensible and what like I think other 1Ls will digest more easily. But worst to best is like how much I actually like the material. So this one's like totally subjective, just our personal interactions with this material. What was the worst to study and what was the best to study?
I'll say that worst was property still. And then next worst was probably legal research. After that, I would say civil procedure, and then criminal, torts, and contracts. So it's basically the reverse order of my easiest to hardest. The only thing I would switch is I would drop writing one.
Wait, so are you saying that your easiest is also your favorite?
Yeah.
Which makes sense, because when it comes naturally to you, you like it. Wait, so contracts was your best, and what was your worst? Property?
Yeah.
Bruh. That's a hot take. Okay, everyone's notoriously like kind of scared of property, but I think contracts is so boring. Oh my gosh, it's like a business class.
I know, it's so fun.
Mine, worst to best, is contracts, torts, civil procedure, property, legal process, criminal law.
Very different.
It is very different. And I think that goes to show two things. Number one, how much we jived with our professor. Number two, our books. Me and Austin had different books for some of these classes, and I feel like the book really changed my view of some of these classes because I enjoyed reading the book. Like, we had the same torts book. That torts book sucked compared to the torts book I had for my first semester that was written by a professor we had. And like my crim book, amazing. I don't know about yours, but my crim book was like so clear. And then the civil procedure book for Cornett, so much better.
Really? I didn't like the civil procedure book for Cornett.
You should have seen ours. It was crazy. It was like the questions at the end of the chapter had nothing to do with the chapter. It was insane.
You actually read the questions and stuff?
With the professor you had to. That's really it for this episode. That was a lot of lead up to our rankings, but I think this will be a really beneficial episode for anyone who is, number one, reflecting on the 1L year after the trauma we just went through. I mean, wonderful experience we just went through. And two, anyone interested in law school or about to do law school, now you kind of have a rundown of what's going on in hopefully a relatively cohesive manner. But long story short, super subjective. You're going to be fine. Then again, we're talking out of our ass. We don't really know what we're saying. But we have a lot of beef with contracts. And that's the moral of the story.
We do not have a lot of beef
No,
with
I'm
contracts.
saying our beef is from contracts. I am anti-contract. I don't believe in them morally. But Austin's pro-contract. You guys want to know the funniest part of this? We're taking contract drafting together next semester. So stay tuned for our express conditions. We're going to hit you where it hurts. Well, thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you all next week.
Be sure to like, subscribe, follow, leave us a rating.
Do all the things. Plus, send us money if you want.
Yeah.
We got to buy more books for next semester. They're expensive.
Thanks.
Oh, and if anyone wants to buy our books, please contact us.
Bye-bye.